AOC insults John Kennedy's sit-down boy, but his response shocks all of America. The air inside the CNN debate studio was heavy charged with an electricity that seemed to hum through the polished floors and bounce off the sleek modern set. Rows of lights blazed overhead, casting a stark glow on the two figures seated at the center of the stage, each poised in their own way like gladiators awaiting the first strike. On one side sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the fiery Democratic congresswoman. From New York, known to the world as AOC, her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp and unyielding, her red blazer a bold statement against the neutral backdrop at 36. She was a force of nature, a social media juggernaut whose every word could ignite a movement or spark a firestorm. Her presence radiated energy, the kind that drew every eye in the room and millions more watching from screens across the country. Across from her sat John Kennedy, the senior senator from Louisiana, man whose folksy charm and sharp wit had made him a fixture in American politics. At 74, Kennedy carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who'd seen it all: decades of legislative battles, countless debates, and a career built on blending Southern drawl with cutting intellect. His gray suit was understated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes glinted with the focus of a man who knew exactly where he stood and wasn't about to be moved. The audience, a mix of journalists, political insiders, and everyday citizens, sat in tense anticipation, their whispers fading as Anderson Cooper stepped to the podium, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another debate, it was a clash of generations, ideologies and visions for America's future set against the backdrop of a nation grappling with division. Tonight's topic: energy policy, a subject that had become a lightning rod in a world increasingly defined by climate crises and economic realities. The stakes were high, the cameras were rolling, and the country was watching. Anderson Cooper's voice cut through the silence, welcoming the audience and laying out the rules. Tonight, we're here to discuss one of the most pressing issues facing our nation: how to balance energy independence with the urgent need for sustainable solutions. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Kennedy, thank you for joining us. He turned to AOC first, his question sharp and direct. Congresswoman, you've been a vocal advocate for the Green New Deal and a rapid transition to renewable energy. Critics argue your proposals are too costly and disruptive to industries like oil and gas. How do you respond? AOC leaned forward, her hands clasped lightly on the table, her voice clear and confident. Anderson, the question isn't whether we can afford to transition to clean energy, it's whether we can afford not to. Climate change is an existential threat. We're seeing wildfires, hurricanes, and heat waves devastate communities, including right here in America. My plan isn't just about cutting emissions, it's about creating millions of jobs, rebuilding our infrastructure, and ensuring no one gets left behind. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of bold action. Her words were crisp, rehearsed, yet passionate, drawing nods from some in the audience and a few murmurs from others. She glanced at Kennedy, a subtle challenge in her eyes, as if daring him to counter her vision of a transformed America. Cooper turned to Kennedy. Senator, your response? Kennedy adjusted his glasses, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, his Louisiana drawl softening the edges of his words. Well, Anderson, I appreciate the Congresswoman's enthusiasm, I do. But let's talk straight. Energy is not just about ideals. It's about people's livelihoods in Louisiana. Oil and gas aren't just industries. They're how folks put food on the table. You can't just flip a switch and shut down refineries without a plan that doesn't leave workers high and dry. Renewables are part of the future, sure, but we need a bridge, not a cliff. His tone was measured, almost conversational, but carried a weight that resonated with the audience, particularly those skeptical of rapid change. The debate began to heat up as AOC fired back, her voice rising slightly but still controlled. Senator, with all due respect, that's the kind of thinking that's kept us stuck for decades. Can't keep kicking the can down the road while our planet chokes. The Green New Deal isn't just a dream, it's a blueprint. We're talking about solar, wind, geothermal, and yes, jobs for those same workers. You're talking about retraining programs, infrastructure investments. This isn't about leaving anyone behind, it's about bringing everyone forward. The audience clapped, some enthusiastically, others more reserved, sensing the growing tension. Kennedy nodded slowly as if considering her words, then leaned into his microphone. Congresswoman, I've heard a lot of blueprints in my time. Most of them look real pretty on paper, but don't hold up when the rubber meets the road. You're talking about retraining folks, but I've met rig workers in Louisiana who've been at it for 30 years. They don't want a government handout or a coding boot camp. They want to know their way of life isn't going to be yanked out from under them. His words struck a chord, earning applause from a portion of the audience, particularly those who saw him as a defender of traditional industries. AOC's eyes narrowed, her smile tight but unwavering. Senator, it's not about handouts. It's about opportunity. If we don't act now, those same workers will face a future where their jobs disappear because the world's moved on without us. We're not just fighting for today, we're fighting for tomorrow. The exchange was sharp, but civil, a classic clash of progressive idealism versus pragmatic realism. For the first 15 minutes, the debate followed a predictable rhythm. AOC pushed for bold systemic change, while Kennedy countered with calls for moderation and practicality. The audience leaned in, captivated by the contrast. Her urgency against his restraint, her vision of transformation against his defense of stability. But the air shifted when Cooper posed a new question, one that cut deeper than policy. Congresswoman, Senator, there's been growing criticism that energy debates often ignore the human cost. Whether it's job losses in fossil fuel regions or the impact of climate disasters on vulnerable communities, how do you ensure your policies reflect the real needs of Americans? AOC seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. This is exactly why we need a new approach. Climate change hits hardest at communities that have been ignored for too long. Low-income families, communities of color, rural areas. My plan prioritizes them with funding for clean energy projects in places like the Bronx, not just Silicon Valley. We're talking about justice, not just jobs. Her words drew cheers, particularly from younger audience members who saw her as a champion for equity. Kennedy, however, tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Justice is a fine word, Congresswoman, he said, his voice steady but pointed. But I'm not sure it pays the bills for a single mom in Shreveport who's worried about her next paycheck. You can't eat justice. You can't heat your home with it. We need solutions that don't just sound good but work for folks who don't have the luxury of waiting for your utopia. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. AOC's jaw tightened, her patience visibly thinning. She leaned forward, her tone sharp but still measured. Senator, I'm not talking about utopia. I'm talking about survival. The science is clear. We're running out of time. If we don't invest in clean energy now, we're not just failing that single mom in Shreveport. We're failing. Her kids, her grandkids, and every generation after this. Isn't about waiting, it's about acting. The audience erupted in applause, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the debate was teetering on the edge of something bigger. Kennedy's smile faded slightly, but he held his ground, his voice calm yet firm. I don't disagree that we need to act, Congresswoman, but action that bankrupts communities in the name of progress isn't action. It's ideology. Folks in my state don't need lectures on survival. They're living it every day. The crowd responded with a mix of claps and murmurs as the divide in the room becoming palpable. It was clear that both were playing to their bases, but the stakes were climbing higher with every exchange. Then came the moment that would change everything. AOC, perhaps sensing an opportunity to seize control, leaned forward, her eyes locked on Kennedy. Senator, let's be real. Your approach is stuck in the past, defending industries that are dying while the world moves forward. Maybe it's time for some folks to step aside and let a new generation lead. The audience gasped softly, sensing the shift from policy to personal. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, his expression still composed, but there was a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or amusement. Before he could respond, AOC pressed further, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade. Sit down, boy, she said, her tone dripping with condescension, a smirk playing at the edge of her lips. The words landed like a thunderclap. The studio fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Anderson Cooper froze his pen, hovering over his notes. The audience sat stunned, some clutching their programs, others exchanging wide-eyed glances in the control room. CNN producers scrambled their headsets, buzzing with frantic chatter. Did she'd just say that? One whispered while another hissed, keep the cameras rolling. Social media exploded within seconds. Hashtags like hashtag AOCV, single quotes, S. Kennedy and hashtag #SitDownBoy. Trending as viewers across the country reacted in real time. Some called it a bold power move. Others, a reckless misstep, but everyone agreed this was no longer just a debate. The phrase boy hung in the air, its weight undeniable for a man like Kennedy, a seasoned senator from the South. The word carried a history, a sting that echoed beyond the moment. AOC's supporters in the crowd cheered, seeing it as a defiant stand against an older, entrenched establishment, but others, including some of her own allies, winced, sensing she'd crossed a line. The camera zoomed in on Kennedy, whose face remained impassive, his hands folded calmly on the table. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't even blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying AOC, sizing her up, not as an opponent, but as someone who'd just made a grave mistake. The silence stretched, agonizing, as the audience waited for his response. Anderson Cooper, recovering, tried to steer the conversation back. Senator, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's point about generational leadership? But Kennedy didn't need prompting. He leaned into his microphone, his voice slow and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of a man who'd spent decades navigating the sharp edges of politics. Congresswoman, he began his draw, softening the steel in his tone. I've been called a lot of things in my time, but I got to say that's a new one. A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension, but Kennedy's eyes never left. AOC sees you want to talk about leadership. Fine, let's talk about it, but let's do it with facts, not cheap shots. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Kennedy's calm was disarming, his refusal to match AOC's fire with fire, catching her off guard. AOC's smirk faltered just for a moment as she realized she might have underestimated her opponent. Kennedy continued, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that filled the room. You see, I don't think leadership's about who's loudest or who's got the most followers online. It's about listening to folks. Real folks, not just the ones who agree with you. It's about knowing that the policies you push don't just affect headlines, they affect people's lives. He paused, letting his words sink in his gaze, sweeping the audience before returning to AOC. Now, if you want to call me boy and tell me to sit down, that's your choice, but I'm not here to play games. I'm here to talk about what keeps this country running, energy, jobs, and the folks who depend on both. The crowd erupted, a mix of applause and cheers, some for Kennedy's restraint, others for his directness. AOC shifted in her seat, her confidence still intact, but visibly rattled, as if she hadn't expected Kennedy to absorb her blow and turn it back on her so effortlessly. The cameras panned across the studio, capturing the reactions. Back, a young woman in the front row clapping vigorously for AOC, an older man nodding solemnly at Kennedy's words, a CNN producer whispering into a headset, "This is gold." On social media, the debate was already spiraling into a cultural moment, with memes of AOC's sit-down quip and Kennedy's calm response flooding feeds. Commentators were split. Some praised AOC's boldness. Others called it a miscalculation that alienated moderates. But one thing was clear: the debate had transcended policy. It was now about respect, power, and the fault lines that ran through a divided America. Anderson Cooper tried to regain control, his voice cutting through the noise. Let's move to our next question: specific policies for transitioning to renewable energy. But the audience wasn't ready to move on, and neither were the candidates. AOC, sensing the need to reclaim the narrative, leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Senator, I'm not here to disrespect anyone, but I'm also not here to coddle outdated ideas. We need leaders who can face the future, not cling to the past." Kennedy's smile returned, small but sharp, as he adjusted his glasses. "Congresswoman, the future's important, but so is the present. And right now folks are worried about paying their bills, not chasing dreams that sound good on paper," the crowd murmured. Again, the divide deepening as the debate barreled toward an inevitable escalation. What happened next would not only define the night, but leave a mark on the nation, as Kennedy prepared to show America exactly how a seasoned leader responds when pushed too far. The CNN studio buzzed with a restless energy, the echo of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's "Sit Down Boy" still reverberating through the audience. Like a struck chord, the cameras unblinking captured every flicker of emotion. Anderson Cooper's strained neutrality, AOC's defiant posture, and John Kennedy's unshakable calm, the Louisiana. Senator sat with his hands folded, his face a study in composure, but his eyes held. A glint of resolve that hadn't been there before the audience split between those cheering AOC's boldness and those unsettled by her jab. Leaned forward, sensing that Kennedy was about to respond in a way that would shift the night's momentum.
Oh.
Social media was already ablaze with, at sit-down boy trending alongside clips of Kennedy's initial retort, but the real battle was unfolding live, under the relentless glare of the studio lights. Anderson Cooper, eager to steer the debate back to policy, cleared his throat and leaned into his microphone. Senator Kennedy, let's return to the topic of energy policy. You've emphasized the need for a practical transition to renewables. Can you outline what that looks like for? States like Louisiana, heavily reliant on oil and gas. It was a lifeline, a chance to move past the personal and back to substance, but Kennedy wasn't ready to let the moment slip away entirely. He adjusted his glasses, his small smile sharpening, and began to speak his Louisiana drawl, wrapping each word in a deceptive warmth. Anderson, I appreciate the question, and I'm happy to talk policy because that's what folks at home care about, how they're going to keep their lights on and their families fed. He paused, glancing at AOC, who sat with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of defiance and weariness. But before I dive into that, let me just say this. I've been in politics a long time, and I've learned that when someone starts throwing insults, instead of ideas, it's usually because they're running low on the ladder. The audience chuckled, a ripple of laughter breaking the tension, but Kennedy's tone remained steady, his gaze fixed on AOC. Now, Congresswoman, you want to lead, that's fine, but leadership ain't about who can yell the loudest or get the most likes. It's about delivering for people who don't have the luxury of waiting for your grand plans to pan out. The crowd erupted in applause this time, particularly from an older audience. Members who nodded in approval. AOC's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. Her eyes narrowing as she prepared to counter. Kennedy, however, wasn't done setting the stage, so let's talk energy, since that's what we're here for, and let's do it with facts, not feelings. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice gaining strength, but never losing its conversational ease. Louisiana's got about 190,000 jobs tied to oil and gas. That's not just numbers, that's welders, rig workers, truck drivers, folks who get up at dawn and come home dog tired to provide for their kids. The Congresswoman's Green New Deal sounds mighty fine in a speech, but it's light on how it keeps those folks employed while we're switching to windmills and solar panels now. I'm all for clean energy. Nobody wants dirty air or water, least of all me, but you can't just shut down one industry overnight and expect the other to magically take its place. That's not a plan, that's a prayer. The audience clapped again, the sound swelling, as Kennedy's words resonated with those skeptical of rapid change. He held up a hand, signaling he wasn't finished. Here's the kicker, the energy information. Administration says oil and gas still account for about 60% of our energy consumption. Renewables, about 12% now. I'm no math genius, but that's a big gap to close, and it ain't happening by 2030, no matter how many hashtags you throw at it. A few laughs broke out, but Kennedy's point landed hard, his use of data cutting through the emotional rhetoric AOC had leaned into earlier. AOC shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the table, a sign she was itching to respond. Her eyes flicked to Cooper, then back to Kennedy, as if calculating her next move. Kennedy pressed on, his voice now carrying a quiet authority. In Louisiana, we've been working on clean energy to geothermal carbon capture, even offshore wind projects, but we're doing it with a plan that doesn't gut our economy. For example, we've got companies like Chainer Energy exporting liquefied natural gas, which is cleaner than coal and helps our allies overseas. That's jobs, that's security, and that's progress without leaving folks behind. He turned to AOC, his tone polite, but pointed. Congresswoman, your plan calls for spending trillions, some say 90 trillion over a decade. I'm curious, where's that money coming from, and how do you tell a refinery worker in Baton Rouge that his job's gone, but don't worry, he'll get a check in the mail? The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Kennedy leaned back, his expression calm but expectant, as if inviting AOC to step into the trap he'd laid. Anderson Cooper seized the moment to pivot. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, your response, AOC. Leaned forward, her voice steady, but laced with urgency, her earlier smirk. Replaced by a determined, focused senator, I hear you talking about jobs, and I agree people's livelihoods matter, but let's not pretend the status quo is sustainable. Oil and gas might be 60% of our energy now, but they're also driving climate disasters that cost billions. Every year, hurricanes in Louisiana, wildfires in California, floods in New York. These aren't just weather, they're warnings. My plan isn't about destroying jobs, it's about creating them. The Green New Deal would fund retraining programs for fossil fuel workers, invest in clean energy infrastructure, and prioritize communities like those in Louisiana that have been hit hardest by pollution and storms. Her words drew applause, particularly from younger audience members, but Kennedy's earlier points about cost and feasibility lingered, tempering the enthusiasm. Alc pressed on her voice, rising, and let's talk about that $90 trillion. You keep throwing around. That's a scare tactic, not a fact. Independent studies like one from the American Action Forum estimate costs closer to $50 trillion, and that includes long-term savings from avoiding climate catastrophe. We pay for it the same way we pay for anything else, by taxing wealth hoarding, closing corporate loopholes, and investing in our future. The crowd clapped. But the response was less fervent than before, as if Kennedy's grounded approach had sown seeds of doubt. Kennedy tilted his head, his smile returning, small but knowing. Congresswoman, I admire your optimism, but $50 trillion still a mighty big number in those studies you're citing. They also say your plan could disrupt millions of jobs before those new ones show up. Folks in my state don't have time to wait for a tax on billionaires to maybe fund a job training program that might work. They need certainty, not promises. His words were simple, but effective, resonating with the audience's practical concerns. AOK's eyes flashed, her patience thinning. Senator, certainty. The only certainty in your approach. It's more pollution, more disasters, and more excuses for why we can't act. The world's moving to clean energy. China's investing billions in solar. Europe's phasing out coal. If we don't lead, we'll be left behind. Kennedy nodded as if conceding the point, but his response was swift. China's building coal plants faster than they're building solar panels. Congresswoman, in Europe, they're paying sky-high energy bills because they move too fast without a backup. I'm all for leading, but let's not lead ourselves off a cliff. The exchange was electric. A masterclass in contrasting styles, her passion against his pragmatism, her vision against his caution. The audience was fully engaged, clapping and murmuring as each landed their points. But AOC, perhaps sensing she was losing ground, shifted tactics. Senator, it's not just about numbers, it's about values. Do we value profits over people? Do we value the past over the future? Your approach feels like it's stuck in a time when we could ignore the science. The crowd stirred, some cheering her moral clarity, others bristling at the implication. Kennedy's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a new edge. Values? I value the folks who keep this country running, the ones who drill the oil, refine the gas, and pay the taxes that fund your plans. And science? I'm all for it, but science don't pay the rent.